One of the core motivations for the October 7th attack was the normalization between the Muslim world and Israel. After the Abraham Accords normalized relations between the UAE and Israel, Palestinian resistance forces became worried that Saudi Arabia would then normalize with the state of Israel without the establishment of a Palestinian state, which would forever condemn them to Zionist subjugation. Many have interpreted Saudi Arabia's willingness to normalize with the state of Israel as evidence of the Gulf monarchies selling out to Zionism, abandoning the Palestinian cause, and accepting their place as subjects to Israeli hegemony. But there are some who argue that normalization could actually have the opposite effect, as the Israeli economy would be opened up to the wealth of the Gulf monarchy, which would invest in it, own it, and essentially vassalize it, ultimately giving the upper hand to the Gulf monarchies. I recently spoke about this with Simon Dixon, who is an author, investor, and financial futurist that analyzes geopolitics through the lens of capital flow. According to him, the wealthy elite are done with Zionism and are dropping it as a toxic asset.
Power is not fully controlled on one faction. It is a power struggle, and I think Zionism will be a toxic asset. Israel will be acquired in distress. Both the Palestinian Authority and Israel will be GCC puppet governments, and their job will be to sell off all of Israel's assets and actually grow Palestine. And then eventually, over time, I think it will be an Arab majority, because only an Arab majority can achieve regional stability. And regional stability in the Middle East is the most profitable investment anyone could make right now, and they're struggling for profitable investments. And so the banks don't give a shit about Zionism. They care about what needs to happen to make money.
In this conversation, Simon Dixon introduces us to his worldview, educating us on the world of finance and how it can ultimately be used to predict the direction the world is heading in.
But I'd like you to start by just very simply introducing my audience to this concept of yours in which you view these geopolitical actions, right, these major events, through the lens of finance, whether it's crypto, Wall Street, etc.
Yeah, sure. So be delighted to do it. So I've spent 25 years of my life in finance, started in investment banking through to trading. So I understand market flows and transactions. And I left before the global financial crisis to work on monetary reform and advocacy for banking reform, and then been an investor in various other things since. So I've always come at everything from the perspective of understanding capital flows, market manipulation, and I never follow media narrative other than knowing that there is an agenda behind every media, and what you are seeing in the media is what that particular function of finance wants you to know. And so there is no real journalism, particularly in these corporations that are often a part of either a government structure or a private sector structure or some kind of affiliated agenda. And so what most people do is they look at headlines and they analyze from the perspective of what information they're giving us. But I've always understood that intelligence agencies and general agendas use media as a mechanism for pushing out the propaganda that they would like to see, hence why your X account. So what I've always done is I study financial flows. I look at balance sheets. I look at companies. I look at sovereign wealth funds. I look at financial and capital markets. And unless the capital markets is backing up what we're seeing in the media, then I know it's propaganda from the way that I analyze. And what I've quite often found is that when it's an old phrase in criminal investigations, follow the money. But follow the money has worked significantly better for me in unpacking, what might be happening. And then with a little bit of experience, that allows me to project forward around a general, who are the new powers of the world? Where is capital flowing generally? What are the structures of power in the world? And therefore I can analyze knowing what I think the end goal is, to how these major events are being manipulated to make us think that something else is happening. And so it's a combination of following all financial flows, and just a deep understanding of how, the investment banking, the retail banking, and the asset management industry works, and where the large pools of capital are, and what that means for geopolitics.
Very interesting. So obviously, when people are interpreting a geopolitical event, they take into consideration a number of different factors. There are many drivers of a nation's interests. One of the important ones is security. I suppose to me, it sounds like what you're most interested in, or perhaps what you think is the most effective way to understand these geopolitical events and the drivers of their interests, is finance itself, is the flow of capital as you described. So do you view capital affecting security, or is it the other way around? Security, having more of an effect on capital?
Yeah, money rules everything, but then sometimes for just geographical reasons, people have choke points, and so they're able to utilize those choke points. But you can normally see, so for example, like by analyzing the profit and loss and balance sheets of US military companies like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, even Palantir, you can see where budgets and where contracts are going from what they transparently have to publish. And I could see several years back that the types of contracts that were being secured in the Middle East were smaller and more defense related than attack related. Also, there was a movement towards cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And I could see the military companies, they never lose revenue. They always have to find, if defense is less profitable than attack, because the more you can attack, the more money there is to be made. And defense, you have to substitute profits with something else, i.e., you're investing in the rebuild through finance, but obviously attack is always the forever war model is the most profitable model. So people often, they analyze, for example, Afghanistan and say that was a failure. It took 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, and they spent $2 trillion. That sounds like a loss. Actually, when you understand what America is, because America is a series of corporate powers that control government and have access to intelligence, and a very successful operation is for the deep state to be able to access the drug trade with poppy seeds, and control certain routes in order to get the drug trade flowing, and also steal $2 trillion from the American people through Pentagon budgets that you launder through to military companies and, colonies like Israel, where they do all the illegal stuff. The stuff you can put on the balance sheet, you do in America. And then you can see that, but the money always comes back to those military companies. And so when you see a media narrative is around, justifying why they need to go to war. At the moment, we're seeing they're killing the Christians in Nigeria, or they're killing the Christians in Syria, or we're taking on the terrorists, ISIS. All of these are just simply narratives for these black op operations and capital flows, because a really successful operation is still $2 trillion from the American people over to the American stock market. And that is a successful operation. You want to do that for as long as possible. And then eventually you can negotiate a military exit, but only once the banks, and like we're seeing in Syria right now, the banks want to get the rebuild contracts. And so they negotiate the rebuild contracts. And if they need to change the regime change a regime, then there are negotiations based upon geopolitical power, like the overthrow of the Assad regime. I believe that everybody in the region had reached an agreement and then suddenly you get the actual execution of that. But one of the things you can see in general right now is that budgets are moving towards Europe. And so when someone asked me what is going to happen next in Ukraine and Russia, Trump was coming along and pretending I'm going to make peace. No, his job was to negotiate the European Central Bank to print more money, negotiate with NATO to increase the budgets up to 5%, and then get that money back into Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Palantir. And there's another $1 trillion of revenue to be made, because I believe that they're moving to the regional stability negotiation in the Middle East. Now, the defense contracts are moving to Asia Pacific. And so they want to sell more weapons in Philippines, in Japan, in Taiwan. And so they ratchet up narrative that China's about to reunify with Taiwan. But they know that that's never going to be a war, because that war can never happen. It would be $2 trillion of economic destruction if that war ever happened, and it won't serve the interest of the military or the technology and all the other power structures that exist. And so when you look at the world right now, we're seeing that we are moving towards the forever war ending in the Middle East, which removes the need for Israel, because they were always a conduit for destabilizing the region. And they have a plausible deniability story. What is plausible deniability? Well, previously, they would never, ever allow anyone to talk about Israel in terms of Zionism, in terms of old Nazi Jewish conspiracy theories, various other things. But once you see Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, and even the revival of cancelled people like Nick Fuentes come online, and they're allowed and platformed to millions and millions of views on YouTube, that's not an accident. That's because there is an operation to strategically weaken Zionism as an ideology, de-radicalize the evangelical Christians, and then at the same time still satisfy those hardline radicalized Americans that believe they want to take out that they need to return the Messiah and various other things. And so this is just an example of make China the fake enemy but never escalate to war, invest in regional stability in the Middle East, and then they're manufacturing civil unrest within America. Depending on your algorithm, you'll get Jew hatred, Muslim hatred, and you'll get narratives like, the Christians, they need to come and save the Christians in Syria and Nigeria. And we're cracking down on drugs, even though the CIA is the drug trade, so we can go into Venezuela. And what you're seeing is essentially America shrinking into a regional power where the military can only make up for lost profits through its neighbors. And so Europe is being sacrificed, destabilized. The traditional tactics of colored revolutions are coming home. And so they're using their own tactics, because the power structure is global in nature. It doesn't care about America. It doesn't care about UK. It doesn't care about Europe. It just cares about the Europeans. It just cares about the capital markets. And so it's asset stripping from the people, redistributing wealth to capital markets, and then they're simultaneously hedging into other regions and where the next profit centers may be. And there is a very, very, very compelling profit center for the first time in a century, allowing the Middle East to end the forever war. Essentially, they're now using financial weapons of mass destruction and technical weapons of mass destruction, whether it be artificial intelligence and surveillance. But they're switching towards regional stability. And you can see all that in the forward-looking financial statements and where the contracts are going and the capital flows, and then combine that with the strategic weakening of the dollar that we're witnessing right now, and also the energy market. So I think when we first met was on a space. And my analysis, which was getting a lot of pushback from everybody, this isn't a real war. This is not Iraq. This isn't World War III. I can tell that from the energy markets. I can tell that from the various financial interests that this is what I call the 12-day theater rather than the 12-day war.
Very, very interesting. There's a lot to unpack. We'll try to take it like step by step. But you mentioned Israel, and I think this is very interesting because, from your perspective, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like you're saying they are reducing the need for Israel. Now, the interview I just did the other day was with a professor of sociology and historical materialism, Professor David Miller in the UK. Um, he was arguing that Israel is um, establishing itself as a Jewish empire, and they are going beyond just the Greater Israel Project, which we understand is visually on a map. What you see from a lot of these far right extremists is like from the Nile River to the Euphrates, right? So from Egypt all the way to Iraq. But he argues actually that they're extending further, that they're reaching into Africa and they are reaching globally through the different industries that they get involved in, the Zionists. So whether that's AI, defense, energy industries, whatever the case may be. So his perspective obviously is not that there's being a reduction for the need of Israel, but actually Israel is continuing to rise and has even more ambitions. And they view themselves as like they're preparing themselves to inherit portions of the U.S. empire, or at least control of it. We don't have to discuss his perspective, but I just provide that to demonstrate that your view is drastically different. So, the other day, Donald Trump announced that there would be a ground force in Gaza to uphold the terms of the ceasefire and maintain stability until further agreements can be made for a lasting peace. To which you replied, once an Arab security force is in place, the Greater Israel Project is over. It was always the Greater U.S. Project to destabilize the region with plausible deniability, which you mentioned earlier. So this marks the start of a new world order. So what I'd like to ask you is, why do you feel that destabilization was in the U.S.'s interest and not in Israel's interest, or at least not being driven by Israel's interests? So when I say, I guess what I'm arguing is escalating with Iran or the war with Iraq, et cetera, whatever destabilizing wars have taken place in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, Iran. Why do you view that as being like solely in the U.S.'s interests and not necessarily in Israel's?
Yeah. Okay. And I'm very familiar with David Miller's work, so I deeply respect that as well. And what I'm saying is that Zionism was an interest group. It had a lobby, and it was a faction of hidden power that is now being brought to the surface. Now we're led to believe that this is a bottom-up movement that is now finally exposed, what Zionism is, which is an imperial project based upon ethno-supremacy to radicalize the Jews into working for the IDF, grow the population, and then get them to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and have an outpost in the Middle East by which you can fund all these covert militia groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and various other groups. Now, the great thing is that by doing it through this mechanism, you have a plausible deniability story. Oh, it was because Jeffrey Epstein blackmailed us. Oh, it was because the AIPAC lobby is incredibly powerful. It was because there's all these Jewish billionaires that control technology, media, and everything. Oh, it's because, so you have all these reasons which are 90% true, but it's only when you understand the monetary flows and power dynamics that I think you can get to the real story. And so what you have to understand is that the structure of America, if you look back at the Constitution, it was designed to protect Americans from the tyranny of government. But what it didn't do is it didn't protect from the tyranny of the government being co-opted by corporate interest. And that is because the founding fathers were the corporate interest. They were the elites. And so the elites constructed a system by which the people could be protected from government, but the elites would end up controlling the government. And that is the structure of America. And by having this whole democracy stroke free market, which there is no free market that has $38 trillion of debt and a government the size of the American government. You have this an illusion. And when you understand central banking and various other constructs, you understand what happened to the British Empire. You compare that to the American Empire and you can see exactly what's happening. So the British Empire was a private interest group called the Bank of England, bankrupted the UK government by creating a Ponzi scheme, which is create money as debt. There's not enough interest to pay off the debt. And so therefore, you have a continual debt cycle. You use war in order to perpetuate debt. That serves the interest of those that profit from wars and the big finance houses. You use mercantilism, colonialism in order to extract resources. And then eventually the government and the pound has no utility anymore. So we entered into the Federal Reserve era in 1913. That took us to World War I. That led to, the confiscation of gold and things like the Balfour Declaration to install Israel, the Bolshevik Revolution to install the Soviet Union over the Russian Tsar, and the funding of Nazi fascist Germany later. Then you have World War II, and then you had the construct of this military-industrial complex and the US empire. It was based upon a manufacturing base. It was based upon installing a debt-based Ponzi scheme called the dollar, but persuading everyone to convert their currencies to dollars as long as you could convert the dollar back into gold. And this is what we call the post-Bretton Woods era. The IMF and the World Bank were set up in order to perpetuate dollars and debt around the world. And then the military-industrial complex was used. Now, at that stage, there was a concept of national interest. Because most of the companies that benefited from the military-industrial complex were manufactured in America, built in America, for America, to perpetuate the dollar. Now, what has happened over time is that that whole mechanism turned into a very elaborate money laundering scheme. And it was that you steal money by continually taking on debt. That means the average American pays the inflation as a result. And this redistributes wealth. And as long as you can get these massive Pentagon budgets, they go back into the corporate interest that receives essentially socialism for companies while everyone else pays the bill in inflation. And anytime the people try to get some money, you call them communists and evil and socialists. And so the people were enslaving themselves to this system. And it got more and more predatory as the debt increased. And so all that to say, what is America? America is actually the financial industrial complex. Whether it be large asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, whether it be private equity firms like KKR and Blackstone, whether it be investment banks like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, or whether it be the creators of the dollar, which is retail banks like Bank of America and Citibank. That makes up a complex. I call it a financial industrial complex. And they fire financial weapons of mass destruction in order to control other factions of power. Subordinate to that is the military industrial complex. Subordinate to that is the technical industrial complex. If you look at Google, if you look at Palantir, if you look at Apple, all of those technologies came from Pentagon budgets. The technologies were created for killing and war, and then eventually commercialized into a corporate structure, handed over to the CIA and intelligence-funded operatives, and then commercialized and created into iPhones and various other things. But they always needed intelligence to steal the resources from Africa. And various other, when you look at all the flows of resource to electric car vehicle or semiconductor chip. And so all of these resources are the covert wars and operations that are fought. But there's one fundamental thing. Because the dollar fundamentally is a debt-based Ponzi scheme, there is no America. There is what I call a K-shaped economy. A K-shaped economy, if you think of Trump when he goes like this, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I need to put a MAGA narrative to make people think that what's happening here is acceptable. And so the media is used to weaponize narrative when essentially all that's happening is the debt ceiling's increased to 5 trillion. A big, beautiful bill has sent $1.3 trillion over to corporate interest. And you need to create a narrative. And he's also reset the world order through tariffs. We'll go into that one in a bit. But to get back to the question, there is a structure above America. And most people focus on the Israeli lobby because they allowed that narrative to slip. And I believe that was a deliberate operation. So when I look at Benjamin Netanyahu, most people think he rules the world via Israel and he's on top of the chain in Israel. When I look at Benjamin Netanyahu, I see just middle management for military industrial complex interest. His job is to siphon money back to the American stock market away from the American people. And when they want to manage that divorce, they just say, oh, it was them. It was only because we were blackmailed. It was only because AIPAC rules the world. They don't say these things, but they allow the narrative to perpetuate, and you become a propaganda outlet for their propaganda agenda, which is to manage a divorce with Israel. Why? Because there's a lot more money in working with the Gulf countries. You got to compare. AIPAC is raising $50 million from Jewish billionaires in America. That's not much money. That's not much money at all. And so their $50 million pays for a bunch of Congress people, but they're normally connected to military companies and financial companies. These are much bigger lobbies. They have way more power. But the AIPAC one takes like the front stage. But when you compare that to Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, creating a $2 billion fund where it was allocated to Trump's family, where they're going to get rebuild revenue in regional stability in the Middle East, the ability to invest in a Trump Tower in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and you get ongoing revenue in a real estate transaction, that can't compete with a $50 million APAC budget. That's a $2 billion.
Simon, if I can, sorry to interrupt. If I can pause you here, I have a question I'd like to ask you. Hopefully you can elaborate on it. So you talked about, you said when they want to manage the divorce. The first question is, who are they? So who are these people that want to manage the divorce? You've already explained why they'd want to, right? There's this transition from the military industrial complex funding to now financial. And you've said that it's because there's much more money in the Gulf. Now, the first question is, who are they trying to manage the divorce? And then the second question would be, if they are currently, whoever they are, managing this divorce, why is the media who propagates and amplifies the narratives that you say are controlled and deliberately representing the interests of these powers above the United States, why are they desperately trying to suppress the conversation? Before what's his name? His name is slipping my mind right now. But before they purchased the guy from the Oracle, his son purchased CBS, and before
Larry Ellison and David Ellison.
David Ellison. Before they purchased CBS and TikTok, there was still a lot of Zionist influence and control in the media. But now there's even more so, and they're actively suppressing these conversations, and they're at war with Tucker Carlson and the likes. So who are they that are trying to manage the divorce? And two, if it's part of this grand transition, why are they fiercely debating and really trying to suppress this divorce, or any talk of it at least?
Yeah, so the power dynamics as I see it, it changes over time. It used to be private banking interest. I talked a little bit about that. Then what happened to that private banking interest is they all went public on the stock market. And so when you financialize and securitize, it then was, essentially those that are committing the IPOs, the investment banks. Now, who is the quote unquote deep state? Well, the deep state was formed around the birth of Bretton Woods II with the creation of the CIA, which was a partnership between the Jewish mob, Italian mafia, and Nazi Germany factions of power as well, to represent corporate interest for the military-industrial complex. So if you have a Pentagon budget, that goes to Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and they contract the deep state and the intelligence apparatus. Maybe 10% of it works for national security, 90% for US corporate interest. But who controls the military once these financial companies? Well, it actually is controlled by access to capital. And so the people that work for these large corporations, they have executives, and most people focus on the executives. They might say, this guy's a Zionist, Larry Fink's a Zionist, or something like that. But who do the executives work for? Well, they work for a board. Who do the board work for? They work for the shareholders. Who are the shareholders? The shareholders are the asset managers now, and foreign interest, importantly. So if you look at BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, they have access to all the American people's pensions, all of the endowment funds, all of the insurance premiums, and they're managing approximately $25 trillion of assets. Through this mechanism of control, the investment banking industry that continually creates these financial products, and the buy side, so it's the sell side, which is the investment bank, the buy side is the fund manager, they have somewhat of a decentralized network. On top of the chain is the asset managers, but they rely upon the investment banks, and the investment banks have factions of power, and then you have military, technical, and various other factions. So then you ask, who are they? Well, who is BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard? Public companies. So who are their shareholders? Well, they're shareholders in each other. Who are their other shareholders? Well, they're all institutional shareholders. So then you look at, this is actually a self-perpetuating scheme. Now, who's the largest foreign investor in BlackRock? Oh, it's the Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund. And then you look further down, it's the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund. Then you look further down, it's the Saudi, and you start to recognize a pattern that America is for sale. Whoever controls BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and this complex is actually dependent upon your wealth. And so when we say they, most people might focus on Zionists, because Zionists is a faction of power, absolutely. But I personally believe the ones that are radicalized, i.e. the Congress members, they're just useful idiots, right? And they go where they are told to go. If they're told that they need to support Zionism, and if they are radicalized into believing that the Messiah is going to return, there's a de-radicalization process, but you can also control that to some degree from factions. But there is also a decentralized power structure there. Now, so I asked myself, how could we get an understanding of who's really in charge here? And I looked at, well, let's look at the distribution of wealth. And the last study that was done with the distribution of wealth, 55% of global wealth is aligned with those that call themselves and identify as Christians. 36% is those that identify and call themselves atheists. 8% is Muslims, with the rise of, the Gulf countries. And then with the rise of India, you had 6% Hindu wealth. Obviously, with the rise of China, you had a rise in atheist wealth. And then finally, at the bottom of the chain, you have a small community, which is 1% to 2% Jewish wealth. But the Christian finance is the larger faction of Zionism. And so you actually look across this and you realize that in its sense, this has been the historical role. The historical role was, let's go back in theology. Sorry to do this, but I think it helps, and then we'll bring it back round to geopolitics. But historically, Christians were forbidden from engaging in banking. And so they created ghettos, and Jews created the banks. Banks became powerful, but they gained power, but they were part of a Christian money laundering scheme, essentially, and then Christians got into banking, and then they removed the removal of usury, and so historically, the power has gone back to this Christian affiliated wealth, but Jews have always performed a function, and I believe that that's what Israel is again, useful idiots for a greater agenda. That yes, what is Zionism? Zionism was a way, and this is the whole history of colonialism, even the formation of America. It was a genocide based upon a narrative that the Christians are civilizing and they're escaping religious persecution from the Europeans. So Europeans came and settled and used religious justifications to recruit an army in order to take over the land, and then rewrote history and controlled narrative to make people think that what they were doing was good. That is how this all works. So Zionism was an ideology that radicalized Jews into, taking their historical roots and saying, come to Palestine, you'll be safe. They joined the army, and then they would fund groups after, wars, and, they would radicalize factions of Muslims through these wars by essentially killing their families. And then creating various other training camps that they funded via US covert operations, via Israel, to create these radicalized militias that could make Muslims look bad. And then they radicalized the Christians by creating this, this narrative that you need to put the Jews there so that Israel can be created, the Messiah can return. And so what they did is they weaponized Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in order to create a very profitable operation that prevented the Middle East ever having what the original Egyptian mission was, to have an Arab League with their resources. Because whoever can unify around their resources in the quote-unquote Middle East or West Asia is going to be between the two superpowers, China and the West. And that is... we would never have had the rise of America and the domination of the dollar if it were not for the covert operations that created the petrodollar and the destabilization of the Middle East. And so it was to somewhat in American interest, but it was actually a mechanism for stealing money from the American people. And the American people are also victims of the same thing. And so this is wealth extraction. This is colonialism 101. And this is narrative control. And if you look at all the financial flows, you'll just see that's what's happening in America. So if you know that there's no more assets to extract out of America, you've got the most liquid capital market in the world. The power structure of finance is not affiliated with America. It wants the capital markets to stay in America. It wants the dollar to work for as long as possible, but it knows that it needs to invest in other regions. Who's the only country in the world that's still got high birth rates? Africa. Who's got all the resources? Africa. Who's got all the energy? Middle East. Who's got sovereign wealth? Middle Eastern countries. Who's got the manufacturing base? China. Okay, this is a falling empire. We need to reallocate capital globally, and we need to reset the map into a multipolar world, and we just use America to destabilize it. And so they're doing destabilization campaigns. They're pushing out Jew hatred, Muslim hatred. They've dumbed people down. They're pushing out left versus right, Republican versus Democrat. Both of them work for the same lobbies. And Europe is being sacrificed. They did a NATO operation to take out Nord Stream pipeline. They ruined Germany's manufacturing base. They cut off Russian oil. They created a hyperinflationary recessionary cycle. The Ukraine war was not sanctions on Russia. It was sanctions on Europe. This was to sacrifice Europe, to vassalize it through financialization and securitization and distress asset investing. And BlackRock owns much of Europe. And who are the other investors in Europe? Qatar, Sovereign Wealth Fund, Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. And what did they do? They said, all right, to get regional stability, I can't execute regional stability unless you give me Palestine. And so they bought Europe and said, recognize Palestine, while they negotiated with the financial industrial complex and said, right, we'll give you this Palantir technology, we'll give you this routes, but what we need to do is we need to get someone like Netanyahu to not too much of Israel is nationalized. We need you to financialize, securitize, privatize, put it all on the stock market, and then we'll buy those assets in distress. Essentially, they did. I believe they're leading up to a regime change in Israel, and so they need all of those polarization and division, because it is civil unrest in the West, and vassalization of the whole Levant, including Israel and Palestine. And if you look at all the monetary flows of Trump's not investing in America, Trump's investing in the Middle East, Trump's borrowing from China, and Trump's facilitating tariff policies that are pushing the whole world closer to BRICS and destabilizing America. That's BlackRock's policy. That's not Trump's policy. So that's the recognition. Governments don't work in their corporate interests once they've been vassalized into this financial industrial complex.
Okay, this was a lot to digest. Very, very interesting. And it's definitely opening my mind up to a whole new way to kind of understand what's happening geopolitically. And so that's fascinating for me. If I could bring you back to the question, however, that I had. So you've answered you've answered who they are. And I understand it's very complicated because of the relationship, which it sounds like a revolving door, as you've stated, right? From the asset managers to the investment banks to sovereign wealth funds, they're all investing in one another, and they are essentially cycling wealth, through each other.
So in a sentence, it's wealth, and wealth changes, and wealth is fluid, and the network can throw your wealth away. If you want to take Elon Musk, decrease his net worth, and increase Larry Ellison's net worth, then you can take the US Department of TikTok, you can put it within Oracle, you can engineer a 40% dump of share price, you can issue him some share options, and then you can allow him to borrow against his stock in order to make additional investments. And so through these financial weapons of mass destruction, you control the major factions of what looks like wealth. And wealth and power dynamics continually change. But you can look at, in a simple way, who are the shareholders in BlackRock as a proxy for who is on top of the Western power structure.
Right. So that answers they. But the other part of my question was, why, I guess, is the media in so many different cases trying to defend Zionism when you're arguing that those who control wealth and represent wealth, they are trying to reduce the influence of Zionism in order to transition from this military-industrial complex to more of this financial-industrial complex, stabilize the Middle East, and essentially inverse the situation between Europe and the Middle East, where it's stability and investment now in the Middle East, but it's chaos and war and defense, essentially, in Europe, and painting Russia as the boogeyman. So again, if that's the case, if that's the plan from these major powers, why is the media suppressing this conversation and aggressively attacking people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens?
Yeah, because it's not an organized cabal. So most people think when you say something like this, they immediately go to a conspiracy theory and think there's a few hands controlling the world. It's actually a power struggle, and it's a continual power struggle. There are factions of power that are desperately holding on to Zionism. Now, if you're AIPAC, what is it that you benefit? Think about this. If you're AIPAC in Israel, what do you want to happen? You want people to believe that Israel rules the world, because that makes them sound way more powerful than they actually are. They're actually a completely distressed economy with a ridiculous debt to GDP ratio that relies upon a welfare state that is 100% dependent upon US budgets and Pentagon budgets and foreign interest. Once that is cut, Israel is not a sustainable economy. It can't function on its own unless it got on with its neighbors and did real trade. But it wants to project we rule the world. Israel grows from population growth. So if you can push out anti-Semitism, then all the Jews will come to Israel thinking this is the only safe place to be. And if you can project we rule the world, then you've got a brand of strength, even though they're very fragile as an economy. Now, what did they do with their money in order to gain power? Well, Israel to me represented the military-industrial complex. Now, the military-industrial complex, this isn't they're sat around in a Bilderberg meeting, and Jamie Dimon's talking to the CEO of Raytheon, and they're planning and colluding. Maybe things like that happen. It's mainly done through power struggles and signals. So I saw October the 7th, for example, as the types of games that military play. And I don't think they know fully the outcome, but they try and influence the outcome. So I think they said to Netanyahu, right, October the 7th, that was allowed to happen. I believe every power in the region knew it was going to happen. I think Iran knew, I think Russia knew, I think China knew, I think US knew, I think Israel knew, I think the Gulf countries knew. They all knew October the 7th was going to happen. And it was a game to reset the chessboard. Netanyahu, either ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, or we're going to move to regional stability and the financial industrial complex are going to come in. But gain as much territory as you can, because we need as much negotiation power, because we're negotiating with the Gulf countries and they got a lot of money. And so you need to get as much territory so that when we actually negotiate the end solution, we've got as much to give back to them and use as our, in our negotiations. And that's the type of games they play. They did the same in Ukraine, various other things. So these are not these powers don't rule the world, as in everything they want happens. It's a power struggle. And so Zionism is still a faction of power. There are people that genuinely believe that if Israel goes down, then Jesus Christ isn't going to return. You're not going to change those people. They're not just going to de-radicalize. But how powerful are they? They're only as powerful as the lobbies that pay them. So if you're AIPAC, what do you need to do to raise as much money as possible? You need to lean into the narrative that we rule everybody. So when everyone's saying AIPAC rules the world, that allows them to raise more finance and actually gain more power. And so what we're inadvertently doing is they push out narratives. Now, do they have the ability to, through influential billionaire, Jewish interest or Christian interest, or, do they have the ability to, acquire media outlets? Yes. And so then you have a power struggle, right? What is my weapon? Well, I've got more influence over YouTube algorithm. Well, I got more influence over X algorithm. Well, I've got more influence over the next films in Hollywood. Well, I got more influence over the deep state. And so normally the military industrial complex and financial industrial complex are aligned. They have been with the forever war model. They've been profiting from the $10 trillion of assets they created while bringing all the revenue back into military companies. But then you switch to a power struggle. The military says, I want Zionism to prevail. I'd like to carry on with the destabilization forever war. And finance says, well, I want to work with the Gulf countries, and the Gulf countries are saying we have to have a Palestinian state and we want to vassalize as much power as we can. So I'm going to actually, through my network, sponsor people to push out a narrative. So one faction of power could be saying, let's give Tucker Carlson and Candace Owen, and let's take Nick Fuentes away from cancel. And they could control the algorithm in order to give them the traffic. And now we can dump Zionism, turn it into a toxic asset, get the whole of America to hate Zionism, think that they're the ethical people, America's ethical, it's only those Israeli terrorists. And, we would never have done that. It was just because of Trump wouldn't do that. He wouldn't sleep with an underage person. You have to be forced by Jeffrey Epstein to do that, you know, and so those types of things. So all this to say is that there is a power struggle, and this is factions of power, and Zionism is still a powerful asset. But ultimately, do I think that Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon give a shit about Zionism because they want to bring back because they care about a Jewish home? Absolutely not. They work for their share price. They have a corporate governance structure. And who is on the board of BlackRock now? Well, actually, the CEO of Saudi Aramco is on the board now. Why? Because they invested significant amounts. And so you can buy power and you can change ideology. And that's what we're witnessing right now. And changing ideology through media manipulation is a deeply destabilizing force. And who benefits from destabilization? Private equity and the industry that's going to be buying all these assets up on the cheap and dumping them on your pension, which is why Trump's policy is just helping every aspect of this. So, power is not fully controlled on one faction. It is a power struggle. And I think Zionism will be a toxic asset. Israel will be acquired in distress. Both the Palestinian Authority and Israel will be GCC puppet governments. And their job will be to sell off all of Israel's assets and actually grow Palestine. And then eventually, over time, I think it will be an Arab majority, because only an Arab majority can achieve regional stability. And regional stability in the Middle East is the most profitable investment anyone could make right now. And they're struggling for profitable investments. And so the banks don't give a shit about Zionism. They care about what needs to happen to make money.
And I'd like you to elaborate further if you can. Why does it matter, this narrative, for people to say, well, it wasn't really us. We were being blackmailed or bribed or lied to, manipulated by the Israel lobby? Why does that kind of narrative matter to these power brokers? You mentioned that they want to de-radicalize a significant portion of the population that are Christian Zionists, evangelicals, that believe in this. So is that why they need to establish this narrative and de-radicalize the population in order to remove support for Zionism as they make it a toxic asset? Or are there other reasons? Is it a combination of several things?
Yeah, so the weaker Zionism is, the cheaper the asset is that you can buy in distress. The more powerful Zionism is, the more powerful the other factions of the negotiation that are holding on to their interests. And so the way that I see it, and again, it's not a perfect science, but I've been pretty accurate in seeing things that most people can't see at the time. So it is essentially in my map of the world, as I see things, is asset valuation and negotiation and leverage. And the more power you can give to a faction, the more weakened you can make, the more distressed assets become.
You tweeted about this the other day, but apparently Israel's steel and defense industries are being potentially going to be sold off to foreign investors. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that fits into the theories and the ideas that you're describing?
Yeah, so if you look at the GCC at the moment, the Gulf countries, I believe that they're playing an element, they compete as well. So as I said, this is not an organized cabal. This is competing interests. But I believe the whole region is on board with the regional stability. And I want to say one thing, and then I'll go back to that. The reason this is happening now, and the reason the last 100 years of analysis are not what I think we're witnessing, is one thing: it's the rise of China and the fall of America. So most people are analyzing from a perspective of dollar dominance, and America is projecting strength when it is actually being strategically weakened. And it's being weakened by the financial industrial complex very deliberately, and it is hedging its bets. So this is not like the rise of BRICS. The word BRICS was actually Goldman Sachs that created that term. Then they created it. This is the financial industrial complex in the West cooperating with the Gulf countries and BRICS in order to reset this world order. So why is the last 100 years of analysis irrelevant? Because that was dollar strength based upon the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex. The financial industrial complex is dumping the dollar now, and it is resetting the world order. So it is negotiating, and China is the manufacturing base. China has the Belt and Road Initiative. China has the rare earth minerals, which are the components of the semiconductor chips that the entire US military is dependent upon. So when you look at America, you know it's all a farce when you look at America relies upon rare earth minerals from China and enriched uranium from Russia. Do you really think they're in a trade war? No. This is the execution of a reset of the world order to change capital flows and make profits in the process. But back to the question. So that's why, the rise of China and the fall of America changes everything. One other thing, and then I'll get back to your question. America is no longer a consumer of oil. It is energy independent. So America they compete with the Gulf countries. So if you look at the flows of capital right now, China's buying all the oil. China's creating all the product. And so the world is working with China because China's negotiating deals where they're doing almost like these barter trades, even with sanctioned countries like Iran and Russia, where they're producing all the goods, they're buying all their energy because they don't have their own energy. They're investing in renewable energy. And America's not even a customer anymore. America's not buying, shit from the energy. In fact, they want to sell their oil and gas to Europe. And so they destabilize Europe to get it away from Russia and over to them. And so they're controlling their sphere of influence. And so if you're a Gulf country, the traditional narrative is, and it was historically accurate, that they're bootlickers of the Zionists and they love America and they just sending all this money to America and they're doing it because the Zionists own them. That historically was a reflection of the power structure at a time. But now they got $5 trillion of sovereign wealth and they need China. They don't need America. So what are they doing? Trump's going around and bragging $17 trillion of investment. What does foreign direct investment mean? You familiar with the IMF? The IMF forced through investment the colonization of countries. The Gulf country buying artificial intelligence, data centers, NVIDIA chips, Palantir technology. That is reverse colonization. Now America's still powerful. They still want this relationship between China and America. In fact, they reduced the petrodollar from 70%, from 100% to 70%. They're going to control the yuan, the petro yuan, and the petrodollar. The position for them is to be an incredible superpower in the middle of all of these different forces. That's why regional stability was so compelling for them. And what did they need to do? They just needed to stop being useful idiots for the American military-industrial complex. How did they do that? Well, China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And when China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, shortly after, we got October the 7th. That reset the chessboard, and now we're getting the moves that I think we're going through right now. So that is why it's happening now. It's because of China, and you can't analyze from the perspective of dollar dominance. Because the financial industrial complex are strategically weakening the dollar to push capital outflows out of America right now. Now, what was the original question? I forgot.
Seizing or investing in Israeli steel and defense industries.
Okay, yeah. So I've seen the first signals of Israel being a toxic asset, which is the bankruptcy of some of their key infrastructure, and it will be placed for sale. Now, the GCC play good cop, bad cop. UAE is historically the most aligned with Zionism in Israel. They led up the Abraham Accords. They were the most important economy. They're the most westernized in terms of Dubai Israeli tourists go over there and various other things. Saudi is kind of playing, they're the powerhouse of the GCC. Now, they compete slightly, but UAE, because of its relationship with Israel, is allowed to acquire assets on the Israeli stock exchange, whereas Saudi's not. And so you can use good cop, bad cop to acquire Israel and have Netanyahu privatize everything and the next GCC puppet government privatize everything. I reckon you're going to see a massive increase in debt to GDP. You're going to see a reduction of investment from America. No, they will invest in Israel, but it will be asset acquisition through the privatized financial industrial complex. And so the finance and the GCC are going to buy the whole of Israel. And I believe that so the more land they conquer, the more the GCC will end up acquiring in the end. And so you had Turkey recently sanctioned the steel company in Israel, and they went bankrupt. That, I guess, my prediction, I haven't seen it yet, they'll be negotiating with the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund in order to do a distressed purchase of that. We also saw recently their IAI, one of their big aerospace, like engineering, military industrial complex companies. They're selling 49%. This is something they've historically tried to control within nationalism. And now they're being fully vassalized, acquired, and you can see that. And I think we'll see more and more deals like that. And I think every deal will be a co-investment deal between the factions of the GCC and US financial industrial complex. But the goal won't be destabilization, elimination of competition, and forever war. It will be regional stability.
Moving forward, what advice would you have for people, the audience listening, on how best to understand what is going to take place geopolitically, so what they should be paying attention to, and then two, how they as individuals can protect themselves? So people are talking about buying gold. In your case, you're very passionate about Bitcoin, and you've talked a lot about crypto and how the GCC and Trump and through this new financial order that's being established, there's the development of these stable coins, which I don't know if it uses the same kind of technology, the encryption technology behind it, or whatever the case is. But the point is, what advice would you have for people in terms of what they should be focusing on how to interpret the world moving forward, and then two, how they can protect themselves and prepare themselves for this new financial order? Is there anything else that they can do? Is it too late?
Yeah. Okay. So a few things on the general macro trend, and then we can get down to the micro. The first thing to recognize: America and China are not in a trade war. They are in a negotiation of executing the fact that China is a rising power, and America is going to be fully vassalized into the financial industrial complex. China is sovereign. China doesn't have a Western central bank. When people talk about the debt of China, that is, they have a state banking system of community banks with a central bank that is fully, all Chinese currency is created for the benefit of China and the China Communist Party and the Chinese people. 99% of Chinese people own real estate. They're not worried about their debt situation. They're worried about the depletion of their savings because of this. Only 15% of imports China's only relies upon America for 15% of their exports. They're fine. They've got massive trade surpluses. So there is no trade war. This is just the execution of the reset of the world order. What does that come with? China generally, while they may become as predatory, they in general want to rebuild countries and protect their interests so that people can buy their products. And they want access to resources, not through regime changes, not through pretending they're exporting democracy, but generally saying, you do you be your country, and let's partner and build. That changes everything. So the IMF model is becoming less and less powerful. You look at Saudi paid off the World Bank debt of Syria, and then is making its investments now. And then as soon as they've made their investment, they'll lift sanctions. Trump will make his investments before the sanctions are removed. The finance companies will get first dibs, and then they'll remove sanctions, and then everyday people can invest and increase the price of the Syrian assets. So they always get the first dibs, and that's what sanctions are for. And so, but what does it mean if we enter into multipolarity? So firstly, it means if the forever war model is over in the Middle East gets to be, and if Iran and Saudi Arabia are normalized because they're both important customers, their most important customer is China, and China's saying we can de-dollarize if we get our shit together and we don't allow for divide and conquer, which is what's happening. It's why Iran's quiet. It's why Iran stopped funding the Axis. It's why I believe they're allowing the hardliners to be taken out. The Middle East will be an incredible growth phase. 100 years of oppression will actually be one of the most important in the region. Tax neutrality, no Western central bank, the ability to hold their own reserves as assets. The Middle East is going to be an incredible growth phase. Now, they also want to control various of their interests in Africa. That's why we're getting the tragedy in Sudan, various other escalations with Nigeria. You're getting Europe coming out of many of their colonies. And Africa, I do genuinely believe, by partnering with China, which is China dominated at the moment, they're going to be allowed to use their resources for probably the first time in centuries. That I believe Africa, which has maintained its birth rates while everyone else's birth rates are just dying because they're drowning in debt and mentally ill and addicted to drugs and homeless and all sorts of stuff. So I believe this is the rise of the global south. The problem is with the global south, the closer you are to America, the more likely you'll be a tool for the forever war. So unfortunately, that hits Venezuela, that hits Central and South America. But China and America are genuinely saying, where are the red lines in terms of our territory? Anybody that gets on the China side is going to grow. Anywhere that gets on the America side is going to be in a forever war. That's the sad thing. And so, that's what I think the map looks like. We enter into multipolarity. What's the future of America? Trump, who's mainly aligned with the financial industrial complex. Remember, Netanyahu's aligned with the military industrial complex. He has factions of the Israel side, but he's mainly a BlackRock guy. He's mainly a JP Morgan guy. He's mainly a deal maker. And he's making a shit ton of investments in the Middle East and extorting a lot. If you follow his money, it's obvious where the world's going. Like, it's in line with that. America, they are going to significantly weaken the dollar strategically, which will push capital outflows, but they're going to pump everything away from the people and into the stock market. So if you are in America and you are in debt, I'm sorry, everything gets worse. And that's the vast majority of Americans. You're probably going to be on a universal basic income, and the immigrants are probably going to find you might as well go back to your country because the growth is going to be better there. But anyone that stays in America, in the West, and they're deep in debt, you've got 5 years to get in a position of wealth, or you'll be eaten by the technical industrial complex. It's going to get more totalitarian. It's going to be a technocratic, ICE-controlled, private military deportation, civil unrest, hate the Jews, hate the Muslims, hate the left, hate the right. Even the installation of Mandani means that they are strategically, weakening. And that's nothing to do with, is he a Muslim, is he a communist? No, this is just a reflection of what the factions of power in New York want. He's not a fight against the system guy. You can look at his Alex Soros funding. Anyway, the future of America is you have to own assets or you'll get eaten alive. And by assets, they're going to pump the hell out of the stock market. They're going to weaken the dollar. and they're going to chuck all the debt on you. They're going to pump it in your pension. They're going to push down interest rates so that you subsidize the bonds that you're going to buy are going to be low interest rate bonds. So inflation is going to they're not even going to beat inflation. They're going to pump it on your pension. They're going to make stable coins back it. The dollar is going to be fully programmable, integrated into artificial intelligence. X is going to be a social credit score. They're going for a full-blown 1984 Orwellian nightmare. Europe is the beta test. All that technology that they were beta testing in Gaza, genocide as a service, occupation as a service, integration with drones, Palantir's coming home. Digital IDs. They know that the enemy of the West is going to be the people, so they need Patriot Act 2.0. That's why civil unrest is needed. They need you to be scared so that you agree to the removal of your rights, just like 9/11. That is, from every single matrix, the future of the West. The rich people, the ones that own the stocks, the ones that own the assets, they'll be fine. The central banks, they're buying gold. The financial institutions, they're all getting into Bitcoin, and BlackRock is, pushing a hostile takeover to get as many people to not own their Bitcoin, but put their Bitcoin with them at the moment. And so the only way to survive what's happening in the West, from my perspective, is to own neutral assets. And neutral assets, the only ones that I know that are fixed supply are Bitcoin, gold. And so that allows you to handle the transition. I personally believe they will outperform inflation, and they'll become tools in a multipolar world for many of the currency wars that are coming. You need to decide where you want to live. I have no doubt in my mind that this is a slow, managed fall of the West, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and you'll end up on a universal basic income if you're deep in debt in 5 years. You've got 5 years to make that transition and decide where you're going to be, what you're going to do. I think the global South will rise unparalleled unless they're close to America. I think the Middle East will be great. They'll be in the middle. And China's going to continue looking after the Chinese people, and therefore the ideology of not having a divided population. They do have challenges with birth rates. They do have challenges with robotics, artificial intelligence, but both of those are going to be robotics and AI centers, and the data and the energy is in the Middle East. Data centers are going to prop up all over the world. They're going to reconfigure all resources around technology. There's going to be data centers everywhere. BlackRock's going to be acquiring whatever they can to build new data centers. We'll probably have a pump and dump. It's probably an AI bubble. But at the end of that, there could be a correction, and then there'll be an industry that is the techno, surveillance, digital IDs, that's coming everywhere. That's just a global trend. So you need to protect yourself. Money outside the system, money in multipolarity, and then you need to decide, are you going to build a falling empire, or are you going to go somewhere where you're going to be part of a growth story?
So it sounds like on an individual level, the micro trends, I suppose, is to invest in assets like Bitcoin, like gold. And if you're going to make investments, you should do so overseas in BRICS economies, potentially, or developing parts of the world where there will be growth. But in the US, there's decline. And so hedge your bets or completely abandon, I suppose, investments in the West. I want to ask you this. You said they're going to pump the stock market.
Just one thing. They'll still pump the US stock market until the last bond can't be purchased. It's just, there's going to be no investment in infrastructure. Any benefits will be because they want BlackRock to manage those benefits. Like, if they get any benefits, it's not for you. It's because they're handing over capital to the financial industrial complex to manage them. So all money is for the power structure of the technical, financial, and military. There's nothing for the American people. So you could buy stocks, and you may do incredibly well. I think it will continue to pump, but they'll continue to pump it, but they're hedging their bets. They'll continue to pump it and weaken the dollar for as long as someone will buy the last bond. Eventually, someone won't buy it.
So let me ask you this. How can stocks be pumped an increase in value when the metric in which they are liquidated is the dollar, and the dollar is being devalued and weakened. So the stock could 10x in price, but if the dollar is quickly inflating and losing value, is it really even maintaining that value? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And here's one really good tip, if I could give it to you. Stop pricing things in dollars. Price things in gold and price things in Bitcoin. Real estate is in a bear market when priced in gold and Bitcoin. The stock market's in a bear market when priced in gold and Bitcoin. Everything's in a bear market when priced in gold and Bitcoin. So when you're pricing things and you're mentally thinking in terms of dollars, you have an issue, and it's different for domestic and it's different for foreign. If you're foreign, for example, if you're Saudi Arabia and your currency is pegged to the dollar, then you are actually subsidizing that peg in a weakening dollar environment. That means that they've got to sell gold or sell treasuries in order to maintain the peg. Eventually, if they're selling oil in dollars and the dollar's weakening, then they'll look to hedge that in alternative currencies with alternative corridors like China and the global south. Plus, at some point, they'll need to depeg. So this is a managed transition. I don't know how long they're going to take. Maybe they take 10 years. The British Empire, when the pound fell, the dollar's going to look like the pound does today. You know, when it eventually, it was a managed 20-year transition. So now that could happen sooner because we're in a technology world and everything's faster, or it could be happen, but they will do managed decline. Now, if you're domestic and all your expenses are in dollars, then you're not experiencing, you've got the weakening of the dollar. Everything's getting more expensive, but you're owning dollar-denominated stocks, and you hope that those dollar-denominated stocks outperform inflation. And I think they will continue to do that until there's some weird systemic event. But the slow transition will be every country that's pegged their currency and their assets to the dollar are going to need to structurally adjust that process. And you're seeing now, who is the largest lender to the US government? It's Cayman Islands. Who's Cayman Island? BlackRock, JP Morgan, hedge funds, structured in Cayman Island. Who's second? UK. UK's bankrupt. They need to sell those assets. Who else is there? Japan. Japan is now removing the carry trade. They've got a massive surplus, massive debt. So they're going to need to sell off those assets, which is why Trump immediately started negotiating, what are we doing with Japan? But the trend is that when you weaken the dollar, they're going to try and refinance the debt by manipulating the short-term interest rate with the Fed. But the truth will be the yield on the 20 and 30-year bond. That's going up. So the 10-year bond is what really structures the auto loan market, credit card market, mortgage markets. The yield's going up. So why are they pushing the short-term rate down? Because they just want to refinance the debt, sell it through Cayman Island to your pension so that you subsidize this. That's the Trump administration's policy. They are running the economy hot, weakening the dollar, while BlackRock is managing and hedging capital outflows. But they'll continue to utilize the dollar for as long as they can because it is a special super subsidy that is giving them more and more power, and they're getting more and more assets. Eventually, they won't control the dollar, and they'll have to denominate in foreign currencies like with China, and that will be structural products. And that's kind of, I won't go into a new rabbit hole, but that's kind of why you're seeing these pockets of vassalization with conflict. So when you saw Pakistan and India, that is them trying to use India to get as much of their foothold in BRICS. When you see the Sudan conflict hit the media and blame it on UAE, that is them trying to get leverage over UAE by ruining their reputation, by exposing the crimes against humanity that they're involved in Sudan. So these are leverage points where they use media in order to get additional negotiations as we draw these conflicts to close. And I want to leave on a positive note. the world is going to be a lot better under multipolarity, but you need to make sure you manage this transition, and you need to decide where you want to live, because if you are in debt in the West and you don't have assets, it's going to be harder and harder. It's not getting better.
Simon, thank you very much for your time today. An hour and a half now, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface. I'm sure there's so much more that you have to share with the this audience of mine, and so I hope definitely we can have you back on again. I want to ask for my audience, those who are interested in following your work more closely. I know that you have an X account. I'm going to be displaying that on screen when I edit this interview. But do you have a newsletter, a website? Is there a place that you generally like to direct new followers where they can follow your work more closely?
Yeah, I'm pretty fortunate to be independent. Bitcoin made me very independent. I sold my company. I don't have Silicon Valley money, don't have a public company, not subservient to Wall Street. And kind of, Bitcoin gave me that level of freedom. And so every week I go live for hours. I can talk if you hadn't noticed. And I connect all the monetary flows this week in Bitcoin and crypto and AI and tech, this week in macro and this week in geopolitics. That's done on my podcast, Bitcoin Hard Talk. It's more geopolitical and macro, and then we cover some Bitcoin and the tech side as well. And then I publish everything on simondixon.com. No sponsorship, no monetization, no products to sell. I just analyze this because it forces me every week to actually do the follow the money work. And by having to publish it every week, it helps me learn by teaching and making sure I'm doing the work now. So simondixon.com, X, and YouTube, Simon Dixon.
Very interesting. And one last question before you go. Where are you based so that people can move there immediately?
I live on a little island with only 85,000 people. It's in the Irish Sea, and it's called the Isle of Man.
Cool. And what is life like there?
It's very peaceful. On the whole island, we only have, you don't come here for the weather. If you want the weather, there's other places. But I moved here from Hong Kong. I lived in London before then. I started preparing for this. I left like a decade ago because I was seeing these trends and knew that it's time to make a shift, and it takes time to do that. But you have 4 people in prison. The front page of the newspaper is if somebody got into a university or somebody hit a pheasant on the street and killed them, and they end up getting fined. That's about as exciting as it gets here.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our next discussion.